The headlights of the sleek, armored sedan sliced through the blinding white fury of the blizzard, illuminating the falling snow like millions of falling diamonds, cold and indifferent to the suffering of the world. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the metallic tang of high-stakes tension. Junho sat in the back, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone, barking final orders to a subordinate about a shipment that had been delayed at the Incheon docks. He was a man who commanded fear, a man whose name was whispered with a mix of reverence and terror in the boardrooms and back alleys of the city. He was the disconnected provider, a king in a castle built on steel and silence. But tonight, the only thing that mattered was the knot of dread tightening in his chest. His mother, Mrs. Park, hadn't answered her phone in 3 hours. She was the vulnerable anchor of his chaotic life, the only softness in a world of hard edges, and the silence from the mansion was deafening. "Drive faster," Junho commanded, his voice a low growl that made the driver stiffen. The heavy iron gates of his estate loomed out of the darkness, usually a symbol of his impenetrable power, but tonight they looked like the mouth of a tomb. As the car screeched to a halt, the headlights swept across the side of the driveway, and Junho's heart stopped. There, huddled against the freezing brick of the security pillar, was a pile of gray wool and human misery. But it wasn't just debris. It was a person. And beneath that person, half buried in the snow, was the familiar, fragile silhouette of his mother. Junho didn't wait for the driver. He burst out of the car, the Arctic wind hitting him like a physical blow, tearing at his tailored suit. His scream tore through the storm. "Get away from her." The panic in his voice was primal. He saw a stranger, a woman in tattered jeans and a dirty gray sweater, leaning over his mother, her hands on Mrs. Park's shoulders. To Junho's terrified eyes, it looked like an assault. It looked like the world's cruelty had finally climbed his walls to take the one thing he loved. "I said get back," he roared, drawing the sleek pistol from his shoulder holster in one fluid, practiced motion. His security team spilled out of the trailing SUV, flashlights cutting the gloom, weapons raised, a dozen barrels trained on the shivering figure in the snow. The woman didn't run. She didn't attack. She simply looked up, her eyes wide and glassy with hypothermia, and shielded Mrs. Park's body with her own. To understand the tragedy of that moment, and the miracle hidden within the horror, we must turn back the clock. The storm hadn't started with snow. It had started with the slow, crushing pressure of silence in a life stripped bare. 24 hours earlier, the sky had been a bruised purple, warning of the freeze to come. Chloe sat on a discarded milk crate in the alleyway behind a bakery that used to give her stale rolls before new management took over. She was 27, but her eyes held the exhaustion of 100 lifetimes. She counted the coins in her palm, the metal biting into her skin with the cold. $3.12. That was the sum total of her existence. It wasn't enough for a hostel, and it certainly wasn't enough for a coat to replace the thin windbreaker that had been stolen while she slept 2 nights ago. She pulled a small, laminated photograph from her back pocket. It was the only thing she kept in a plastic bag, safe from the rain and the grime. Her father's face smiled back at her, frozen in a time when laughter came easily. "Dignity, Chloe," he had told her on the night the bank took their house, his voice trembling but his chin high. "Dignity is the only coat they can't take off your back. You wear it on the inside." He was gone now, lost to a sickness they couldn't afford to treat, leaving her with nothing but his philosophy and the fierce, burning will to remain human in a world that treated her like garbage. She kissed the photo and tucked it away against her heart. The wind picked up, whistling through the alley like a mournful ghost. Chloe stood up, her joints popping, her stomach twisting with a hunger so old it felt like a companion. She had to keep moving. If she stopped moving, the cold would win. She adjusted the oversized, tattered gray wool sweater she had found in a donation bin weeks ago. It was ugly, unraveling at the hems, and smelled faintly of mothballs, but it was her armor. Chloe began her walk, a meaningless pilgrimage through the city's veins. She walked not to get somewhere, but to keep the blood flowing. She walked past the windows of restaurants where families ate steaming bowls of stew, their laughter muffled by the glass, a soundproof barrier between the living and the ghosts. As night deepened, the snow began to fall, soft at first, then aggressive, erasing the boundaries of the street. She found herself drifting toward the heights, the district where the houses sat far back from the road, guarded by gates and cameras. It was quieter here, safer from the predatory gangs of the downtown shelters, but colder, so much colder. The wind here didn't get broken by skyscrapers. It whipped around the manicured hedges with a vengeance. It was then that she saw the impossible. A small figure was wandering down the center of the road, dressed in a silk housecoat and slippers. Slippers. In a blizzard. Chloe rubbed her eyes, thinking it was a hallucination brought on by hunger, but the figure stumbled and fell. It was an elderly Korean woman, her silver hair matted with wet snow, looking around with the terrifying, vacant confusion of a mind lost in time. This was Mrs. Park. She had slipped out the side door while the maids were changing shifts, her mind trapped in a memory of a garden from 40 years ago, looking for a rosebush that didn't exist. Now, she was freezing to death on the asphalt of her son's empire. Cars drove by. Expensive cars with heated seats and tinted windows. One slowed down, swerved to avoid the debris, and sped up again. Another honked. No one stopped. The bystander effect was in full force. The rich assumed someone else would handle it, or perhaps they simply didn't want to dirty their interiors. Chloe watched from the sidewalk, shivering. She could keep walking. She should keep walking. Getting involved with the wealthy usually meant police, and police meant trouble for someone with no ID and no address. But then she heard it, a small, whimpering sound, carried by the wind. It wasn't a cry for help. It was the sound of total resignation. It was the sound her father had made at the end. The echo of that memory stopped Chloe in her tracks. Dignity is the only code. The words rang in her ears, louder than the storm. She cursed under her breath, a puff of white steam, and stepped off the curb. She ran toward the fallen woman, her worn sneakers slipping on the ice. When Chloe reached her, Mrs. Park was already turning blue. Her skin was like ice, and her eyes were unfocused, staring at a sky she couldn't see. Halmoni, Chloe whispered, using a word she had picked up from the Korean grocer who sometimes gave her bruised apples. Grandmother? You have to get up. Mrs. Park didn't respond. She just shivered, a violent, rattling vibration that shook her small frame. Chloe looked at the gate. It was locked. The intercom buzzed with static, but no one answered. The storm had likely knocked out the perimeter wiring. They were trapped outside, mere feet from warmth, but it might as well have been miles. The snow was accumulating fast, burying Mrs. Park's legs. Chloe knew the signs of hypothermia. She had seen it take friends in the night. The shivering would stop soon, and then the sleep would come, the final sleep. Panic, sharp and jagged, rose in Chloe's throat. She tried to lift the woman, but Mrs. Park was dead weight, and Chloe was weak from days of starvation. She managed to drag her to the brick pillar of the gate, providing a few inches of shelter from the biting wind. It wasn't enough. The silk robe was soaked. Mrs. Park's breathing was shallow, a terrifying rattle in her chest. Chloe looked down at her own chest. The gray wool sweater. It was the only thing keeping her core temperature above critical. It was her survival. If she took it off, she would have nothing but a thin, threadbare t-shirt between her skin and the sub-zero gale. She looked at Mrs. Park's face. The wrinkles, the softness, the face of a mother who had once held someone the way Chloe wished she could be held. There was no decision, really. It was instinct. It was the undeniable imperative of a good heart. Chloe pulled the sweater over her head. The cold hit her instantly, a million needles stabbing her torso, knocking the wind out of her. She gasped, her teeth clattering together instantly. Here, Chloe stammered, her hands shaking so hard she could barely coordinate her fingers. She wrestled the wool sweater over Mrs. Park's head, pulling the woman's arms through the sleeves. It swallowed the small lady, a cocoon of gray warmth. It's okay, Mama. I got you. Chloe pulled Mrs. Park into her lap, wrapping her own freezing arms around the wool, trying to share what little body heat she had left. She became a human shield, her back to the wind, taking the brunt of the storm. Minutes turned into an eternity. Chloe felt her toes go numb, then her fingers. The pain was excruciating, burning like fire, before fading into a dangerous, heavy nothingness. She started to hallucinate warmth. She thought she smelled her mother's cooking. She hummed a lullaby through chattering teeth, rocking the stranger back and forth. Just hold on. They're coming, she whispered, though she didn't believe it. She was fading. And then, the lights appeared. The screeching tires. The shouting. The gun. The immediate aftermath was a blur of chaos and sensory overload. Junho stood there, his pistol aimed at Chloe's head, his chest heaving. I said step away, he screamed again. But Chloe couldn't move. Her muscles had locked up from the cold. She simply blinked, her eyelashes crusted with ice, and whispered. She was cold. The words were barely audible, carried away by the wind, but Junho heard them. He saw the gray sweater on his mother. He saw the woman before him shivering violently in a wet t-shirt, her skin mottled and pale. The realization hit him like a physical punch to the gut, staggering him more than any bullet could. He lowered the gun, the weapon slipping from his fingers to land softly in the snow.
Nana.
Junho fell to his knees, ignoring the snow soaking his suit pants. He pulled his mother into his arms. She groaned, shifting in the warmth of the gray wool. She was alive. Sir. The head of security rushed forward. The ambulance is 2 minutes out. Junho looked at Chloe. She had slumped over the moment the weight of Mrs. Park was removed, collapsing onto the ice like a marionette with cut strings. Check her. Junho barked, his voice cracking. Check her now. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare of flashing lights and sirens wailing like banshees. Junho rode in the ambulance with them, holding his mother's hand, but his eyes kept darting to the other stretcher, where paramedics were cutting the t-shirt off Chloe to apply warming pads. Critical, one paramedic shouted to the other. Core temp is 34. Frostbite on the extremities. She's going into cardiac arrest. The monitor flatlined, a high-pitched, singular tone that pierced the air. Charging. Clear. The body convulsed.
Junho watched, horrified.
He had almost shot this woman. He had pointed a gun at the person who had stripped herself bare to save his world. The guilt was a suffocating oil slick, coating his insides. He squeezed his mother's hand so hard she whimpered in her sleep. At the hospital, the waiting room was a purgatory of white walls and ticking clocks.
Junho pached, a caged tiger.
He had bought this hospital wing 2 years ago, a tax write-off, but now money seemed useless. A doctor, looking exhausted, finally emerged. Mr. Kim, he said, using the family name. Junho stopped, holding his breath. Your mother is stable. She's confused, and she has mild hypothermia, but she'll recover. The wool sweater. It likely saved her life. It trapped enough heat to prevent the heart from stopping. Junho let out a breath that was half-sob. And the woman? The one who was with her? The doctor's face fell, his expression grim. She is in the ICU. It's more complicated. She has severe frostbite on her fingers and toes. She was malnourished before the cold hit. Her heart stopped twice in the ambulance. The doctor paused, looking down at his clipboard, then back at the most powerful man in the city. We found a photograph in her pocket. It was wet, almost ruined.
A man.
And she had $3.12 in change. That was everything she had, Mr. Kim. And she gave your mother the coat off her back. Junho sank into the plastic chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. He looked at his hands that signed million-dollar contracts, hands that had held a gun to a savior's head. He felt small. He felt like a pauper in the presence of true royalty. He stood up, his face hardening with a new resolve, a different kind of power. Take me to her, he commanded, but this time, the voice wasn't the growl of a mafia boss. It was the whisper of a man who owed a debt that could never be fully repaid. I need to see the woman who saved us. The sterile hum of the intensive care unit was a jarring contrast to the howling wind that had nearly claimed Chloe's life. When she finally opened her eyes, the world was a blur of white sheets and silver machinery. Her hands were heavily bandaged, throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache that synced with the beating of her heart. For a terrifying moment, panic seized her. The instinctive panic of the homeless who fear that any interaction with authority will end in a cell or a shelter that feels like a prison. She tried to sit up, but her body felt made of lead. Stay still. A deep voice commanded from the corner of the room. It wasn't angry, though. It was thick with an emotion she couldn't place. Junho stepped out of the shadows, his tailored suit rumpled, his eyes rimmed with red exhaustion. He looked less like the king of the underworld and more like a man haunting a graveyard. "The bill," Chloe croaked, her throat dry as sandpaper. "I can't pay the bill. I have $3. It was the first thought in her mind, the survival instinct overriding the pain. Junho flinched, as if she had slapped him. He walked to the bedside, his movements hesitant, afraid to break the fragile thing he had almost destroyed. "There is no bill," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You bought this room. You bought this entire wing, as far as I am concerned." With a gray wool sweater, he reached out, hovering his hand over her bandaged fingers, terrified to touch them. "The doctor said you might lose sensation in your fingertips. He said you gave my mother your heat until you were empty." Junho looked away, ashamed.
Why?
"You don't know us. I pointed a gun at you." Chloe looked at the ceiling, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "She looked like my Nana," she murmured. "And nobody should die alone in the cold. Not even if they're rich." The simplicity of her answer shattered Junho's remaining defenses. He was a man who dealt in transactions, loyalty for protection, money for silence, blood for blood. He had no currency to calculate the value of selfless love. Mrs. Park, recovering in the adjacent room, was wheeled in a few hours later. The reunion was tearful, a scene of raw, unfiltered humanity. The elderly woman, usually so proper and reserved, wept openly, holding Chloe's bandaged hand against her cheek. "My daughter," Mrs. Park sobbed, a declaration that carried more weight than any legal adoption. "You are not going back to the street. You are coming home," and for the first time in years, the word home didn't feel like a lie to Chloe. It felt like a promise. The transition to the mansion was not a fairy tale. It was a slow, painful thawing of two frozen worlds. Chloe moved into a guest suite that was larger than the entire house she had grown up in, yet she spent the first week sleeping on the floor next to the velvet bed. The mattress was too soft, the silence too loud. She felt like an imposter in a museum of wealth. She would wake up at 4 a.m., driven by the habit of needing to move before the police came, only to realize she was safe. Junho watched her from a distance, observing her struggle with a mixture of fascination and guilt. He saw how she folded her towels with military precision, how she ate every grain of rice on her plate as if it were her last meal. She was a constant reminder of the reality he had walled himself off from. One evening, Junho returned home from a brutal negotiation, his knuckles bruised, his soul darkened by the violence of his industry. He found Chloe in the kitchen, not eating, but helping the cook peel potatoes. She looked up, seeing the darkness in his eyes. Instead of recoiling, she poured a cup of barley tea and set it silently before him on the marble island. "You look like you're carrying the sky," she said softly. Junho stared at the steam rising from the cup. "I do bad things, Chloe," he confessed, the first time he had ever spoken of his work to a civilian. "I do them so my mother can wear silk and sleep safely. But today I feel like the silk is choking me." Chloe reached out, her fingers still sensitive and scarred, and touched his hand. "My dad used to say that a man is only as bad as his last choice," she told him, her eyes clear and piercing. "You have tomorrow. You can choose differently tomorrow." It was a challenge, not a platitude. Junho looked at her, really looked at her, not as the homeless woman he had saved, but as a woman who possessed a strength he had never been able to buy. She wasn't impressed by his money, and she wasn't afraid of his reputation. She saw the man beneath the monster. That night, Junho made a phone call to his lieutenants. He canceled a shipment of illicit goods. It cost him millions. It was the first time he had chosen dignity over profit. Seasons in the mansion turned with the slow grace of a healing wound. Winter melted into a tentative spring, bringing with it a transformation for both Chloe and Junho. Chloe didn't just exist in the house. She began to bloom. With Junho's support, she enrolled in night classes to finish her GED, with plans to enter nursing school. The sharp angles of malnutrition softened, her skin glowed with health, and the haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a spark of determination. But she never forgot. She kept the tattered gray sweater in a glass box in her closet, a relic of the night she died and was reborn. Jun-ho changed too. The disconnected provider began to reconnect. He started coming home for dinner, drawn not just by his mother, but by the woman who sat across the table discussing biology textbooks with a passion that mesmerized him. The romance didn't arrive with fireworks. It crept in like the dawn. It was in the way he started wearing softer colors because she said the black suits made him look sad. It was in the way he insisted on driving her to her exams, waiting in the parking lot for 3 hours just to see her smile when she walked out. One rainy afternoon, they were walking in the garden where Mrs. Park had once been lost. The rain was gentle, washing the world clean. Jun-ho stopped, turning to Chloe. "I used to think power was about control," he said, watching a raindrop trace the line of her jaw. "I thought if I built walls high enough, nothing could hurt us."
But you.
You tore down the wall with nothing but a sweater. He took a step closer, the magnetic pull between them undeniable. "You didn't just save my mother, Chloe. You saved me from becoming a machine." Chloe looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the vulnerability he hid from the world. "We save each other," she whispered. That's what people do. When he kissed her, it wasn't the aggressive claim of a mafia boss. It was the tentative, grateful surrender of a man who had finally found his home. 3 years later, the city was blanketed in snow once again, but inside the great hall of the estate, the air was warm and scented with jasmine and roses. The wedding of the year was taking place, but it wasn't the gaudy affair the tabloids had expected. There were no politicians or rival gang lords. The pews were filled with staff, Mrs. Park's elderly friends, and people from the shelter where Chloe now volunteered. Standing at the altar, Jun-ho looked handsome, not in a way that commanded fear, but in a way that radiated peace. He watched the doors open, his breath hitching in his throat. Chloe walked down the aisle, and a collective gasp went through the room. She wasn't wearing a designer gown worth a fortune. She was wearing a dress of simple white silk, elegant and understated, but around her shoulders, draped like a royal stole, was a piece of gray knitted fabric. She had incorporated yarn from the old sweater into her shawl. It was a statement, a flag. She walked with her head high, the noble sufferer, transformed into a radiant bride. Mrs. Park sat in the front row, weeping joyfully, clutching a handkerchief. When Chloe reached Jun-ho, he took her hands, the hands that still bore the faint white scars of frostbite. "I promise," Jun-ho vowed, his voice trembling with emotion, "to never let you be cold again. I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman who gave everything when she had nothing." Chloe squeezed his hands, her eyes shining. "And I promise," she replied, "to remind you that your heart is warmer than you think, and that love is the only coat that fits us all." The kiss sealed not just a marriage, but a pact between two souls who had traversed the vast distance between the gutter and the penthouse to find that they were equals in spirit. The years flowed like a river, smooth and deep. The time jump showed the ripples of that one act of kindness expanding outward, touching lives far beyond the iron gates. The estate became a sanctuary, hosting charity galas not for social clout, but for genuine change. Jun-ho dismantled the violent arm of his empire, transitioning fully into legitimate shipping and construction, building low-income housing where the slums used to be. Chloe became a registered nurse, working in the very hospital where she had been treated, known for her uncanny ability to comfort those who had no one else. On their 10th anniversary, they returned to the spot where they had met. The brick pillar was still there, cold and unyielding against the winter night. A light snow was falling, an echo of the blizzard that had brought them together. Jun-ho, now graying at the temples, parked the car, a family SUV, not an armored sedan. In the back seat, 2 children were sleeping, safe and warm. He stepped out with Chloe, wrapping a thick cashmere coat around her shoulders, pulling her close. They stood in silence, looking at the patch of pavement where tragedy had almost occurred. "It feels like a different lifetime," Jun-ho murmured, his breath forming clouds in the air. "It was," Chloe answered, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It was the end of one life and the beginning of another." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old laminated photo of her father. She held it up to the streetlight, The image faded, but the smile still visible. He was right, she whispered to the wind. Dignity kept me warm. But love kept me alive. Junho kissed the top of her head. Let's go home, he said. As they turned back to the car, they saw a figure down the street, huddled, shivering, walking against the wind. Without a word, Junho opened the trunk. He pulled out a heavy thermal blanket and a care package they always kept stocked, a habit Chloe had instilled in him. He didn't send a servant. He didn't call the police. The former Mafia boss walked into the snow, his wife smiling proudly by his side, to pay forward the debt that could never be fully settled. The circle was complete. The warmth had been passed on.